Have you ever sat around, watched people kind of just walk? And have you ever noticed that some people look like they're constantly falling forward, while some people might look like they're grounded and stable and it looks kind of almost effortless? What it really comes down to is where the movement is being driven from, either from your pelvis or your cranium. So let's talk about what that means, and let's start to peel back this topic on sacral versus cranial-driven systems. So at its core, human movement is meant to be sacral-driven, meaning our pelvis acts as the foundation for posture and balance. Now, when this system works properly, movement is smooth, alternating, it's adaptable. This is what we see in young kids, athletes, people who move naturally. But what happens when the pelvis stops being the foundation, and what happens when things move upwards? So not everything is, exact one for one, but generally when the pelvis loses stability, the brain needs to find a new way to stay upright. And this is where this cranial-driven system comes in, where we start to use more vision, more auditory cues. We might bite down more. But instead of the pelvis driving the movement, the head and the neck start doing the work instead. And so this is when you see that classic forward head posture, tight traps, and the body always looks like it's kind of on the edge of falling forward. So we see this a lot in older adults, desk workers, and definitely people who are under chronic stress. So once this pattern starts to set in, it's ridiculously tough to break unless you can retrain the system and understand how it is twisted within that individual. All right, so now we get to the fun part. Here's where things get really interesting. So your breathing patterns are directly tied to which system is driving movement. So sacral-driven breaths have a tendency to use the full diaphragm. They have a tendency to support alternating movements. And they also, sacral-driven movement has a tendency to provide more relaxation and efficiency, where cranial-driven breaths have a tendency, and what I mean is the overuse of the neck, mouth breathing. There's a couple different strategies for this, but they have a tendency to overuse the neck, the chest. You notice that these people are sympathetically more driven. Their fight and flight response are all over the place. And also, their rib cage movement becomes very stiff a lot of times. And so there's supposed to be a certain amount of articulation, which we'll talk about in another episode, of movement that goes through the rib cage, which these people lost. And so they are rigid, they can't alternate, they're stuck in their cranium, and they are completely ungrounded from this world. Okay, so now we're hitting the most important part of the video, which is, after hearing all of that, how do we know if we're in a more cranial-driven system or a more sacral-driven system? So, not sure which one you're running? Try these quick tests. So, first one, stand normally. Do you feel pressure on your heels, or are you leaning forward onto your toes? If you notice that you're more on your toes, you're probably a more cranial-driven system. 2, weight shift test. Try shifting your weight from left to right. Does it feel natural? Or does your head want to lead with the movement? Or do you notice that you can't smoothly shift through your SI joint? Those things that feel kind of herky-jerky are a sign that your system has been overextended. And then the last is you can do a breath test. Take a deep breath in. This one's really easy. If your shoulders rise instead of your rib cage expanding, there's a good chance that you're probably stuck in a more cranial-driven pattern. So if any of those feel off, don't worry, you're not alone. Most people lose sacral control over time, especially as we age. But the better question is, how can you regain it, or how can you maintain it? All right, so you did the tests. You figured out that you're probably a more cranial-driven system. What do we do now? All right, well, first off, we need to find exercises like exercises that work on grounding your heels through your pelvis. 90-90 with hip lift is a great place to start. I highly recommend, I've recommended it in previous videos. Please check it out. It's from PRI. It's a fantastic place to start. 2, I would recommend working on, while you're in that process, working on rib cage expansion. Now, you'll notice that I put that as number 2 because we talked about earlier, If you can't find your heels, your rib cage doesn't start to expand. So it's important that you pay attention to what order. 3, start looking for exercises that incorporate more alternating movements. Get off the barbell. Stop trying to do things so symmetrically. Look for things where you move back and forth. And finally, number 4, start looking for exercises where you need to pay attention to where your head is in space, where you have to pay attention to those visual cues and learn how to relax. Retro walking is excellent for this. Any type of loaded carries is also fantastic for this. Just make sure whenever you're performing these type of things, you want to make sure that the individual is well grounded so that your risk of falling is extremely low. But all of these are great places to get started to make a more sacral-driven system versus a cranial-driven system. So this brings up why in personal training, in physical therapy, people are always trying to get more glutes, more core. Well, I'm here to point out that those things are true, but at the heart of the matter, more glutes and more core are more sacrally driven systems. And so I think we're talking the same language, but we got to make sure that our end goal, our end game is right. Because if you get these people up and they have glutes and they have a core, but they don't find their heels, so what? You're just going to have really strong people who are agitated all day. That's what you're going to get. So make sure that you like and subscribe down below because we're just getting started. We're episode 8 in and I keep saying we're just getting started. There's so much to cover when it comes to how we move, how we intercept things. So like and subscribe down below again, and I'll see you guys on the next one.